Hello, guys. LC Holt here. And this is my update for the week of June the 24th. Today is our 50th episode. And to celebrate episode number 50, we're going to be talking about probably one of the most controversial events that's happened in the last 100 years, certainly in the 20th century in America, but I would almost say anywhere in the world, if you think about all the rabbit holes that have been dug about this particular subject matter. What is the subject matter, you might ask? Well, the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, which happened on November 22nd, 1963 in Dallas, Texas. Before I get into a brief description, because what we're going to do, we're going to talk about the events of the day, the man that the Warren Commission deemed was responsible, and then we're going to talk about some of the conspiracy theories. So that's a lot to fit into an hour, right? So before we jump into the story itself, let me introduce to my right, Rebecca Ivy.
Hello.
Those who watch the show will know Rebecca, one of my longest compatriots. Another of my frequent collaborators on this show is Zach Myers. Zach, how are you doing?
Good, man.
And yet another of my regular friends on this program is Ryan Rainick. Ryan, how you doing, bud?
How you doing?
Good. And I think we're going to have a pretty interesting show today. We're going to talk first about the events of that day, November 22nd, 1963. This was an important trip for the president, John F. Kennedy, to make. And it was very important that Dallas be one of the primary stops. He had started the trip to Texas in San Antonio, then moved to Houston. Basically, the idea of this trip was threefold. He was trying to help raise money for the Democratic Party. He was trying to mend fences amongst warring factions of the Democratic Party, specifically in the state of Texas, after he and his vice presidential running mate Lyndon Johnson narrowly won the presidency and vice presidency, respectively, in 1960. Beyond that, he was trying to start his bid for re-election in 1964, which would have been the next year. There had been a lot. He had a troubled presidency. There was the Bay of Pigs, a failed invasion of Cuba. There was the Cuban Missile Crisis. There was some failed summits with Khrushchev, who was the premier of Russia at that time. And he had a lot of physical ailments. He had just had the miscarriage of, I think it was the third miscarriage that he and his wife, Jacqueline, had of a child. So this trip to Dallas was announced in September of '63. The motorcade route was finalized and published in the newspapers a couple days before the parade itself. Now, the route was chosen through Dallas to maximize visibility of the president and the vice president, who was also there. He was in the motorcade as well. Basically, they were going to arrive at Love Field, which was the airport locally in Dallas. They were going to make a 45-minute, very slow ride to a place called the Trade Mart, where the president was going to have a luncheon, and he was going to make a speech with local civic and business leaders. Now, this was a 10-mile trip. So they had plenty of, 45 minutes is quite a lot for a 10-mile trip. So the idea was kind of to meander through downtown Dallas, and then eventually you would get to the freeway. And then once you hit the freeway, you'd be at the Trade Mart in the matter of a few minutes, less than 5 minutes. And then after the Trade Mart, they would return to Love Field. He would board Air Force One again, fly out, and then have dinner in Austin, Texas that night, along with another speech. Now, there were three primary vehicles in this motorcade. The first one was an unmarked white Ford with the police chief, the sheriff, a Secret Service agent named Lawson, and a Dallas field agent for the FBI in that lead car. The second car was a 1961 Lincoln Continental convertible limousine, and that's the car that had an FBI agent named Greer in it, who was the driver. It had Governor Conley, who was the governor of Texas at the time, his wife Nellie, and John and Jacqueline Kennedy. The third car was a 1955 Cadillac convertible that had a couple of Secret Service agents in it, a guy named Kenny and another guy named Hickey. And then it had 4 other agents on the running boards, and there were 2 presidential aides in that car. The fourth car is the one that had Lyndon Johnson, his wife, Lady Bird, and a senator named Ralph Yarborough were in that from Texas. So basically what happened was he had a breakfast speech in Fort Worth, and then he flew to Love Field. We're talking about the president here, on Air Force One and his wife. 15 minutes into Love Field. They left Love Field, the airport, at 11:40 a.m. for that, 45-minute, 10-mile journey, the parade route. Now, the crowds were up to 150,000 to 200,000. There was a hugely warm reception, which was unusually warm in Texas, where a lot of people were not big fans of Kennedy. I mean, they liked Lyndon Johnson because he was a local boy, but in terms of the president himself, they were not generally huge fans. In fact, there were leaflets being distributed in the crowd that day at the parade that said "Wanted for treason," and it showed John F. Kennedy, because a lot of people blamed him personally for the failure, say, of the Bay of Pigs, the Cuban invasion. Now, they entered Dealey Plaza, which was basically their last turn before they hit the freeway. So they were only about 5 minutes away from the Trade Mart when they turned off of Houston Street onto Elm Street, heading down Dealey Plaza. This was about 12:30 p.m., so it'd be 30 minutes after noon, noon. They turned left. They were moving toward the freeway past a school book depository. Now, this was a 7-story building, and they packaged school books for about 5 or 6 states, including state books for Texas, for textbooks for schools. And so they had to go past it. They slowed down to about 10 miles per hour. Now, you have to remember, this is right at the end of this parade route. So I'm sure everyone's like, breathing a sigh of relief because, hey, that went well. In fact, Nellie Conley, who was the governor's wife, turned to the president and said, Mr. President, no one could say Dallas doesn't love you. And he said, I think you're right. And that was actually the last words ever spoken by John F. Kennedy, because once they turned onto Elm Street, there was a little tree there. As they passed, right before they passed under that tree, there was a sound that at first people thought was a car backfiring or one of the motorcycles, because there were motorcycle policemen on either side of the car riding in tandem with it. What it actually was a gunshot. Now, Governor Conley, having been an experienced hunter, he knew that sound. He realized that was the sound of a rifle. And the plaza, being what it is, with buildings surrounding it on all sides and like a kind of a grassy area in the middle, sort of a courtyard, the echo of that gunshot bounced around a lot, which may account for the fact that people think they heard more than one shot, or more than 3 shots ultimately. But that's neither here nor there, because what Governor Conley did when he heard the rifle blast is he turned. He was looking to the left and he turned his head to the right. And he tried to look back and see John Kennedy. But he said he was a man of, some girth. He couldn't quite get his body to turn all the way to see the president, to make sure he was okay after that first shot. So he started to turn back. Well, right about that time, the car had passed underneath the tree, which had blocked the view of the sniper from the book depository on the 6th floor, come to find out. As soon as the car moved past that tree, there was a second shot, which Conley did not hear. That shot actually hit its mark. The first shot completely, missed the car, right? Second shot hit John Kennedy in the back, came out of the front of his neck, and it went into the back of John Conley, who was sitting in the front seat. It entered right beneath his armpit, and it went through, cracked one of his ribs, and came out right beneath his right nipple. So Conley suddenly realized that not only were they being shot at, but they were being hit. And so he screamed out. He said, "Oh my God, they're going to kill us all." And right after that, there was a third shot, very rapid after the second. The third shot actually tore the right side of President Kennedy's head off in a pretty big spray of blood, skull, and brain matter, which has been caught on the Zapruder film, which is a very famous piece of film that runs very short, but actually shows all of this in pretty graphic detail. Because on the second shot, when he got hit in the throat, you can see the president, he lifts his arms up like this, his fists right under his chin. And he holds him there, and Jackie turns to him, like noticing he's in distress. And just a few seconds after that, you see the head blow off, the right side of the head. Now, what happened then was Jackie apparently went into immediate shock, as one would when they saw their husband's head just get blown off, like 3 inches from him. She saw a piece of his scalp fly onto their trunk hood, and she, in this state of shock, went for the piece of scalp as if she, she was going to glue it back on or something. But she went, you're in a crazy situation. So she went and she tried to grab it. And as she did that, this Secret Service agent named Clint Hill jumped off the running boards of the first car behind them, which would have been the third car, and ran and jumped onto the trunk and threw her down into the seat and the president and laid on top of him. And then that's when the car took off onto the freeway. It should also be noted that Clint Hill actually heard the first shot, jumped off of the running board before the second shot rang out, but didn't get to the car because they were moving like 10 miles per hour. Didn't get there until after the third shot. So he actually sprung to action pretty quickly, if you think about it. Now, as they drove to the hospital, it was pretty clear that the president was not going to survive. In fact, Nellie Connolly later said that Jackie was in the back seat saying, "I have my husband's brains in my hand," again in a state of shock. They made it to Parkland Hospital, and they rushed him in there, and it was pretty clear, he was not going to make it. They also took John Connolly there, even though his wounds were pretty severe because he had a sucking wound through his lung, where it went into his armpit and came out beneath his nipple. They actually had to do 2 surgeries on him, but he survived. The president, pretty much, they just had to wait until every bit of respiratory and heart function ceased. And at that point, they decided to declare him dead, even though it was pretty clear he was gone before he reached the hospital. He still had some activity. So being the president, they waited until 1 p.m. and that's when they called that all of his vital activity had ceased, and so they declared him dead. It was announced 30 minutes later because Lyndon Johnson told the Secret Service, he said, "Look, if we announce that he's dead before I get on Air Force One, what if they come for me and Jackie?" So the idea was, you get me, the president's body, and the first lady on the plane, and then when we're in the air, you announce it. And so that's what they did. That's why it wasn't announced until 33 minutes later. It was interesting, the people that came to get the body out of the hospital, there was actually a brief scuffle between some of the medical personnel in Dallas who said by law they had to do the autopsy since he died in their city in Texas. The Secret Service was like, fuck off. And they knocked these guys aside and, got the body out of there. 2 p.m., by 2 p.m. they were in the air. And the president, Lyndon Johnson, was sworn in as a replacement. He actually wasn't sworn in until 2:38. Now, the official autopsy took place later that evening from between, I think it was 8 p.m. and midnight at the Bethesda Naval Hospital. So that's when they did the actual official autopsy, which determined that the president died because he didn't have a skull on the right side of his head, which seemed pretty obvious. Now, the first wound he sustained to the neck was obviously a fatal wound, most likely. But anyway, so sorry, I just saw I saw the chat and it made me laugh. John Parks, what do I like ice cream? What is my favorite flavor? You got me with that one, man. I was like talking about people's heads blowing off, and I looked over at the chat, and I was like, John Parks is talking about Mr. Random. Rocky Road,
I was
buddy.
going to say Rocky Road.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know, we would go around the table on that one, but after the brief bit of levity about presidents' heads blowing off, thanks, John. Now, I want to talk for a moment about the man who was who was suspected of this from the get-go. A guy named Lee Harvey Oswald. I don't know what his favorite ice cream was, but I do know that he was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, October 18th, 1939. His father was a Marine. His mother was crazy. He had an older brother named Robert Jr., and he was also a Marine. Now, he and his brothers, his brother and his mother moved around a lot when he was a kid, from New Orleans to Texas to New York. He was a very troubled kid. He had a lot of problems growing up, probably not the least of which being that he had a mother who was just very domineering. And it seemed like all the sons in the family wanted to get away from Marguerite Oswald as quickly as possible. That's probably why he went into the Marines when he was 17. Now, I'm going to kind of briefly shoot through this, okay? Because Oswald is probably and should probably be a show unto himself. But going, kind of just giving you a brief history, I think will at least enliven what will come later in terms of talk about conspiracies. He was a radar operator in the Marines. Oswald went into the Marines like his father and like his older brother. He was actually a sharpshooter in the Marines, but he was not a very good soldier because he got court-martialed 3 times. First time it was because he shot himself in the elbow with a .22 caliber handgun that he shouldn't have had. And then another time is he got into a fist fight with one of his superiors who tested his knowledge about something. I think it was having to do with rifles and shooting. And then the third time he actually got, he was court-martialed because he fired into a jungle in the Philippines while he was on night sentry duty, and they could never figure out why he did it. And apparently he just did it for fun. And say that again, Zach? Yeah, he probably was bored. That's right. He learned a little bit of Russian while he was in the Marines, which came into play later. He was discharged on September the 11th, 1959, mainly because his mother was sick. And so he got what they call a hardship discharge, which is an honorable discharge so that he can go take care of his mother. That was just from active service. He maintained for a few years, he maintained his status as a Marine just on, what do you call it? Not active duty, but, well, he was a weekend Marine, but he defected to the Soviet Union. Now, this is something that he said quite a lot later, is from the time he was 15 years old, he determined he was a Marxist, meaning the philosophy of Karl Marx. Slightly different from communists. He always liked to make that distinction. Not a huge leap from Marxism to communism, but he liked to make that distinction. In 1959, which was the same year that he left the Marines, instead of taking care of Mama, he decided to take his ass to Russia. And he flew to Moscow. And on October 31st, Halloween, he decided that he went right into the U.S. Embassy in Moscow and he said, I want to renounce my citizenship and I want to become a Soviet citizen. And so he handed in his passport, but they wouldn't take the renouncement of his citizenship because once you do that, you can't come back. So, that's it. So they were like, look, kid, you might want to think about this because, this guy's like 20 years old. Yeah. So they let him stay there on a visa that was like 6 days. And then after that, the Soviets told him, okay, you can't stay here. Like, we don't know you. You're an American. You were a Marine. For all we know, you're a double agent. So you got to take your ass back to America. And so Oswald responded by slashing his wrist. They put him in a psychiatric hospital. And then after that, they said, okay, kid, you can stay. What's your favorite ice cream? No, I'm kidding. But he met while he was there a 19-year-old young girl named Marina. She was a pharmacology student. And while he was living the short time that he lived in the Soviet Union, he wound up marrying her after 6 weeks of courtship. And they had a child that was born in 1962 named June. And then in the month of June, Oswald decided he didn't want to be in the Soviet Union anymore. So it's a good thing he didn't renounce his citizenship. He went and got his passport back and moved back to the United States. When he arrived back in Dallas, Fort Worth, he expected like people at the airport waiting for him. They're like, oh, this defector, he's coming back. Let's interview him. And like nobody was there. Because something about Oswald is he always wanted to be special. That's something his older brother Robert said a lot. Like Lee always thought he was better than everybody and was like in a constant battle to prove it. Now he moved in with his mother and his again when he moved back to Dallas, but now he had the wife and he had the child. He had 2 jobs during that time period, neither of which kept him. He quit the first one because he didn't like it, and the second one fired him because he kept picking fights with the other people. Because he was the kind of guy who had a very rude and arrogant attitude, according to people that knew him and that worked with him. Now, in March of 1963, he mailed. Say that again, Ryan.
Haters.
In 63, he mail ordered, because you could do this back then. You could actually mail order firearms, an Italian Carcano rifle, and he bought a .38 Smith & Wesson Model 10 revolver, a handgun. And the next month, coincidentally, a man in Dallas, General Edwin Walker, who was a very anti-communism, very outspoken right-wing political figure locally in Dallas, was shot at through his window with an Italian Carcano rifle. I wonder who could have done that. And just before that happened, Oswald posed with the Carcano rifle in his backyard in a rather infamous photograph. And he had the handgun right there, the Smith & Wesson .38, in his belt. Well, he posed that way, and then he shot at this Edwin Walker guy, and he hit the window frame. And fragments of the bullet hit Walker in the hand, but, you know, that was it. And the would-be assassin scuttled on out of there, having failed completely in this assassination attempt. He went on with his life, and that October, he got hired at the book depository. By this point, him and Marina, his wife, were living apart. They had a second daughter that was born in 1963. So Marina and the 2 children were living in a town called Irvine, Texas, with a lady named Ruth Payne. And Oswald was living in a rooming house there in Dallas while he worked at the book depository. Now, the day of the shooting, he was last seen on the 6th floor about 11:55 a.m. That was about 35 minutes before the shooting. Now, his activity in the building is kind of sketchy because people say they saw him at different times in different places. So somebody's got to be wrong. Like there was a foreman who saw him making a call on the 1st floor. And then like 10 minutes later, a janitor saw him also on the 1st floor. But then like 10 minutes after that, a coworker saw him eating lunch, and it seemed like he'd been there a while on the 6th floor. So depending on who you talk to, he's popping all around this building. Whoever was right, the fact is, when the president was shot, less than a minute and a half after the shooting, a cop and Oswald's supervisor positively identified him in the 2nd floor lunchroom drinking Coca-Cola. The cop came in, pointed his gun at Oswald, and he said to the supervisor, he said, "Who's this guy?" And the supervisor was like, "It's all right, he works here." And so they, went on exploring the building because they knew at that point that because a man named Howard Brennan had seen a man matching Oswald's description on the 6th floor firing the shots. So they knew at that point that somebody in that building had shot the president. But because Oswald, a minute and a half after the shooting, was on the 2nd floor drinking a Coca-Cola in the lunchroom, they were like, well, this couldn't be the guy. So he just walked out of the front of the building. He boarded a bus. He returned to his rooming house and he changed his jacket. And then he boogied on out of the rooming house and he was walking down the street patrolman named J.D. Tippit pulled him over because by this point, this description that Howard Brennan gave of the man in the window had been distributed. It looked a lot like Oswald. And next thing you know, several shots were fired from a Smith & Wesson Model 10 .38 caliber revolver. Tippit falls dead. A man matching Oswald's description runs away, gets to the Texas Theater and ducks inside without paying. A shoe store clerk next door sees him and says, "That guy didn't pay, call the cops." So the cops arrive. They go in there, they bring up the house lights. They say, "Excuse me, sir, could you come here a minute?" And he pulls the gun and he starts to go for him, and they basically beat the shit out of him and drag him out of the place. And he's screaming, "Police brutality, police brutality." They interrogated him for 2 days at the headquarters of the Dallas Police Department. Now, Oswald's story comes to a pretty abrupt end because on Sunday, November 24th, Kennedy's hardly cold at this point, he's being transferred from the city jail to the county jail through a parking garage down beneath police headquarters. And they have all the cameras in the world set up in this garage, and they're all filming from different angles, and this is a live broadcast. And at about 11:21, an hour after they were supposed to transfer him, it had been delayed for an hour, Oswald comes walking out in police custody. A local nightclub owner named Jack Ruby steps out of the crowd, cries out Oswald's name, and shoots him point blank range in the abdomen. Oswald cries out, falls to the ground, is rushed to the hospital, Parkland Hospital, incidentally, where the president had died 2 days prior. And he dies basically from extensive internal injury from this bullet, single bullet that bounced around inside his ribcage after he was shot. He was 24 years old when he died at Parkland Hospital at 1:07 p.m. on November 24th. Ruby, who I'm sure when we talk about the conspiracies, was tied in ways to the mafia, was ultimately convicted of murder. That conviction was overturned later because a court of appeal deemed that it was wrong, that he was not granted a change of venue given the circumstances of this case in Texas. Actually, he died technically an innocent man, Jack Ruby, but he had lung cancer, so he did not survive to enjoy it. But his whole conviction was about to be overturned when he died. So that is basically a very brief rundown of the events of the JFK assassination. And when I say brief, that's incredibly brief because there's actually a lot more to it. Like I said, you could do a whole show on Oswald, but I wanted to give at least some time here, like half the show, so we could talk about some of these theories. Now, I'll go through a list briefly of some of the people that these theories point to as being responsible for the Kennedy assassination. Yeah, the CIA, organized crime, Cuba, Cuban exiles, Lyndon Johnson, George H.W. Bush, Sam Giancana, J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, the Secret Service, the KGB, South Vietnam, international drug lords, a French heroin syndicate. Who do you think it was, Rebecca? Answer me now. But yeah, there's a long list of people responsible, and that's the short list. I could go on further because there are so many theories about JFK, it's not even funny. Now, Robert Kennedy. Yeah, I should just say Robert Kennedy did believe that there was a conspiracy. He actually died thinking that there was a conspiracy. Anyway, go ahead, Ryan.
You said because I didn't know this till you said it. So he snuck in the movie theater, and during like a presidential assassination, they were worried about who was seeing the $2 movie. They were really like, this was a problem.
Yeah,
like, what spurred that?
It was probably even cheaper than that.
I mean, his initial. Well, I'm saying maybe it was something else, but was there an initial problem with him that like, hey, pay for this movie? Like that was really what got him like triggered in the first place?
Really, in terms of the theater, that was the thing that got their attention, other than the fact he was just looking generally disheveled and like he had just run, a long distance in a short time. But yeah, they just said, hey, that guy went in without paying. It just so happened. It just so happened that guy had just murdered a police officer. Or did he? There's a lot of questions about this, and there are so many theories we could go into. Where should we start? There are people who think that this was a military coup d'etat. Senator Ralph Yarborough, who was in the fourth car with Lyndon Johnson, actually kept pointing out that if JFK had lived, they probably would not have extended the Vietnam War, and that Lyndon Johnson was perhaps involved with the assassination because they promised him the presidency if he promised the military a continued involvement in things like Vietnam. There was a movie that came out called 7 Days in May that was just before the assassination, which was very, very famous. John F. Kennedy actually liked it. And it was about an American military coup d'etat overthrowing the American president because the military felt that they could run the country better, essentially, and that the president was going to be. So it's kind of ironic that he liked that movie, and a lot of the theories, have that coup d'etat element to it. Now, in terms of the Lyndon Johnson thing, I know we got one guy here on this show who seems to think that Lyndon Johnson had something to do with it. And I'm not talking about Robert Kennedy, because he's not on this show. I'm talking about Ryan Raynick.
Lyndon Johnson was a dick.
Why do you think Lyndon Johnson had something to do with this?
This is really more, I mean, other than common sense, where, if you're just looking for someone like, oh, if this guy dies, I get to be president. So there's going to be, even if he was the nicest guy in the world, there's going to be, what's the term I'm looking for? He's got motivation. You know what I mean? He's but not necessarily just because you're the vice president doesn't necessarily you want to be president. But I think in his case, he was very power hungry. I think the speeches he gave were Hollywood, where he didn't mean a word of it. I think this is something you really, really wanted. And if you look, like you were talking about the coup d'etat, which it makes a lot of sense because organizationally and structurally, power really hasn't changed since the Kennedy assassination. I've even heard they take the president as soon as he gets elected and said, "This is what happens if you fuck up." Like I've heard like that story where they take every president, no matter who it is, no matter how special they think they are, and said, "Look, this is what happens if you cross the line. We're gonna fuck you up." And this is our proof. Like, it's a pretty big, and granted, I've never seen it, you know what I mean? Like, I'm just speaking on hearsay. But at the same token, that would be a way that you would think keep people in line, be like, hey, if you think you're special, we killed John F. Kennedy at, the apex of a pyramid in the middle of Texas. So, yeah. I mean, it's a deterrent if you want to run the country without the president getting in your way. You know what I mean? You would think like you would just kind of keep using that business model.
Well, the thing about Lyndon Johnson, too, is he was never a big fan of John Kennedy. He thought he was an upstart from a rich family. And Lyndon Johnson, at this point, was the majority, when Kennedy was elected, was the majority leader of the Senate. He knew how to work the Senate. Like, Lyndon Johnson was a born and bred politician. He knew everybody's name. He knew what their wives' names were. He knew how to intimidate them if he needed to. He knew how to sort of finesse them if he needed to. He was a real politician, and he saw this guy, Kennedy, coming up out of the blue. And, Kennedy, at the time he was elected, was the youngest man ever to be elected president of the United States, and also the first Catholic. But that's neither here nor there, really, in terms of what I'm talking about now, because Lyndon Johnson was, in a lot of people's mind, the next in line, at least as the Democrat. Obviously Richard Nixon, who ran against Kennedy, was the vice president at the time, and they thought, well, he's obviously the next in line. But in terms of Democratic candidates, Lyndon Johnson was the next. But Kennedy had done this even when he was a senator. He jumped over a lot of people who were next in line. There were a lot of people who wanted that senatorship before Kennedy, who had earned it. But Kennedy, being who he is and having the father and the family that he had and the money he had, was able to jump over them. And that's kind of what happened here, because Lyndon Johnson was going to run as the Democratic nominee for president in 1960. He lost the delegation, the nomination, to John Kennedy. And so John Kennedy offered him the vice president's seat, primarily because Kennedy was told that if you don't get Texas, you're not going to win. And the election
Texas Texas and Florida, I think they were concerned about. I think it was kind of equal. If they didn't get Texas and Florida, they weren't going to win it.
Yeah, exactly. So he needed Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson would rather have been president, but he would settle for vice president right now. And so he did.
For like a minute.
Now, Bobby Kennedy, who was, always John's right hand, he wound up being his attorney general, hated Lyndon Johnson. And the feeling was mutual. Because Bobby Kennedy was, he was fiery. He was the fiery young one who always had something to prove. And he was not wanting to be intimidated by this big Texan who towered over everybody. And Lyndon Johnson, if you wanted to, make you change your opinion, would just kind of stand over you and it was like I think they called it the Johnson stare, where he would just literally get nose to nose with you, and he would look down on you and look right in your eyes and like get you, like physically intimidate you. Bobby didn't like being intimidated physically or otherwise by anybody. And even though he wasn't a particularly big man, he didn't take kindly to people doing that because he had something to prove. So he didn't like Lyndon from the giddy up and tried to get Lyndon Johnson to take his name off the ticket voluntarily, which Lyndon was not willing to do. So that's the Lyndon Johnson side of the conspiracy. I wanted to kind of jump into the mafia element too, because a lot of people point to that. Here's the deal with the mafia. When John Kennedy was running for election, his pappy, who I don't have a great regard for, is a man named Joseph Kennedy. Joseph Kennedy was friends with a Chicago mobster named Sam Giancana. And Sam Giancana, I tell you, man, nothing more gangster than a name like Sam Giancana. And he ran Chicago, and he got a lot of ballots allegedly stuffed in the state of Illinois for Kennedy. So when Kennedy became president, Sam Giancana was like, I had a lot to do with that. So maybe you could help me out. Well, Robert Kennedy makes it his mission as soon as he becomes head of the Justice Department to go after organized crime in the biggest way ever in U.S. history. So I'm sure this probably pissed off Sam Giancana quite a bit, because we got your brother elected, and now you trying to make a name for yourself, Mr. Robert Kennedy, are going after us something awful. Hated Jimmy Hoffa, head of the Teamsters. Bobby hated him almost as much as he hated Lyndon Johnson. And I'm sure the feeling was mutual there as well. Now, Jack Ruby was an associate of Sam Giancana because Jack Ruby was originally from Chicago. He only moved to Texas to help his sister run nightclubs. And he had a lot of failed nightclubs. And the Carousel Club, which is the one that was the successful one, was the one he was running when the assassination took place. Now, it's, I think, worth noting that a lot of the girls from the Carousel Club, I'm going to try and keep this kind of a little less complicated than it actually was, but there was actually a union for strippers. And this union for strippers, a lot of these unionized dancers came from New Orleans, from a guy named Carlos Marcello, who ran the mob in New Orleans and a lot of strip joints. He also knew Jack Ruby. Carlos Marcello was deported on orders of the Kennedy administration back to South America, which is the only place at that point they could deport him to, because trying to get him out of New Orleans and out of the country in general when they were trying to clean the slate on mafia. Now, Marcello was sort of, he had a lot of hands in the Dallas Mafia and with Jack, including Jack Ruby. So let's see. Am I leaving anything else about the Mafia? There's so many things about the Mafia you could state. What do you guys? I want to get Zach in there too, because Zach, you haven't been able to talk too much. So the Mafia, Zach Myers, of which you are a member, we all know. Do you think they had something to do with this assassination?
Actually, out of all the theories and stuff, that's always been my, I've leaned towards that idea more than a lot of other ones. Because we all know.
We all know what? Say it again.
Well, I mean, the Kennedys, we all know, like, who they are and who they're, who tied to and stuff. So it's just, that's just what I've always leaned towards is it probably was, mob affiliated.
Wasn't he messing with the money supply too? Like, wasn't he trying to back like 5 billion in silver?
Talking about Kennedy?
Yeah,
I'm not sure on that.
I'm pretty sure it was like I think he was just like starting like the whole process of what he was trying to do. I think it was I forget the actual amount because there's an amount he would like started at was like just this, it wouldn't have like solved all the problems, but like it tipped them off that this guy had, intentions of messing with the money supply. And historically, that's what gets everyone killed. We let Saddam Hussein shit on us for a decade until he started like, oh, I want to make, Iraq its own, I'm going to take it off the Federal Reserve note. And it's funny how he was hung like, instantly. You got away with multiple wars. You provoked us in every way possible. But the moment you talked about the money, you were dead.
Well, they always say follow the money on all these things, especially with the mafia. Follow the money.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the actual printing and production of the money. I'm talking about the Fed.
I couldn't really say because I don't know.
You're because at the time, if you're the Fed and you have just accomplished something fairly new in history, which was our first completely fiat currency. We had only been off the gold reserve so long. And that was a big, big deal. That was like the entire point of the operation was to get into the earth to give up all their valuables for this stupid paper money. The biggest con there's ever been, and we continue on this day. But that would be something like to me historically that it stands out. If you mess with the money supply at all, although his particular foray, I guess, into that issue wasn't that bad comparatively speaking to say like what Lincoln did. Lincoln was trying to give us an interest-free currency, and that just got him dead instantly. And Kennedy wasn't quite, that route. But knowing that they got off the fiat currency, got onto a fiat currency with no gold backing, they didn't want silver or anything else behind it either.
Well, Zach, what do you think?
I've heard that before. I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, I've heard that theory somewhere else before, so I don't know if that's what was going on or anything. But he was tied to all kinds of shady shit. So
now let me say something here. Rebecca has a really interesting one, which she turned me on to. Now you guys need to hear this one. This was a part of a doc. Well, I'll let you explain it because I find this one particularly entertaining.
It's very entertaining. I saw this documentary on Netflix several years ago, and it was called JFK: The Smoking Gun. And it's taken from a book called Mortal Error. And there's this guy named Donahue, and he got involved with studying the Kennedy assassination. They did a news special about could someone pull off the shots like Oswald did. And he was an expert, rifleman and ballistics. He was into all this stuff. And he did the shots. He's like, yeah, it's possible it could happen. Well, after that aired, I guess he started looking at the bullets and all these things. And I think he came to the conclusion, what was it, an AR-15 did the third shot because of the way his head just exploded. He just didn't think that was the rifle that Oswald had. So he starts studying it. And basically, he also, he's trying to figure out, the line of the shot, just all these things. And he thinks that George Warren Hickey Jr. in the car behind the president's car, when the first and second shots rang out, he stands with a gun, takes the safety off, and the gun is an AR-15. But when all the cars start speeding up, he thinks Hickey jerked back, and when he did, the gun went off, and the gun was pointed towards the president's car, and that was the third shot to Kennedy's head. It's a real
the Secret Serviceman actually shot the president.
Yes.
Accidentally.
The shot to the head.
I think the math involved in all of that, you're talking hundreds of billions to one.
But yeah, it's a book, Mortal Era, and then they did a documentary called JFK
I'm gonna
Smoking Gun. I just think it's kind of, entertaining.
But isn't it hilarious? Just the idea of this guy that stands up and he's just like, he's trying to protect the president, and then he gets a bump and the fucking gun goes off.
Because he took
Like
the
Peter
safety off.
Griffin is their Secret Service.
Like Mortal Error starring Will Ferrell
Yes,
as Hickey.
yes.
I would watch that.
Yes, but it's kind of funny because
I
we
would
have
too.
conspiracy theories, and then you have this one that's just a goofy.
Yeah, and we should.
I mean, he
like,
was still shot, by Oswald, but the one that blew his head off was
a Secret
an
Service
accident.
man
Yeah.
who forgot he took the safety off, the AR-15.
Yeah.
I love that. I know conspiracy theorists hate that.
Yes.
That's not a very popular
No.
conspiracy theory because it removes all the stuff of like it's the mob, it's Cuba, there's no like intricate shit. It's just the guy hit a bomb and accidentally shot the president in the head.
Wasn't there one where the driver did it? Like where the driver turns around and like I think it came from the film where it kind of looks like as he turns around, like the shot's like instant. Have you ever seen what I'm talking about?
Are you talking
Like
the driver of his car, of the Lincoln?
Like he turns around, like it's after. I wish I would have watched the footage last night. I've seen the footage, many times, but I haven't seen it. I didn't watch it in the lead up to this, and I remember that like just staring at it, like you have to if you see this, you have to actually like pause and rewind. It like looks like if he were to have a gun, it's so, and there's like this little flash I think that like accentuates it. So it's one of those things to where like I don't know. I remember I watched them like loop like several years ago, just be like, I can't tell, nothing definitive or anything, but it was George Bush.
We can talk about that too, because there's a whole theory about that. There was
the George Bush thing. I mean, the guy to me, I think he was power hungry, like in his 90s. He seemed to like he still wanted to have wars and stuff, like out of his wheelchair. You can't spend all your time grabbing Terry Hatcher's ass. So he was. I don't know. It seemed like the family got a lot of power that never ended after the whole ordeal. Is all I'm saying.
Well, the thing about the George Bush is based around this FBI memo from November of '63 that mentions a guy named George Bush with the CIA who had had a briefing about Cuban exiles in Miami, and people were like, "Is that George H.W. Bush? What are the chances?" And they said it was a guy named George Williams Bush, a totally different George Bush. George Williams Bush said, "No, they're not referring to me. I was never briefed about Cuban exiles in Miami." It should be noted, though, George H.W. Bush wasn't appointed the head of the CIA until 1976. And as far as we know, he had no affiliation with the CIA at this point in time. But Gerald Ford appointed him head of the CIA in 76. I don't know. I know another funny one of mine is like the umbrella guy.
Yeah.
The umbrella. What are you saying, Zach?
I was saying, yeah, I heard that one before.
Yeah, the umbrella guy that's in a part of the Zapruder film too, because at one point in the Zapruder film, the car goes behind a street sign, and when it comes out the other side, that's when you see the president getting hit and putting his hands up to his throat the first time he was hit. And at the same moment, just in that street sign, you can see an umbrella, a black umbrella, sticking out from behind the street sign. And there are other photographs from different angles that shows a man in a black suit holding a black umbrella up over his head on a sunny day in Dallas when no one else on the street has an umbrella. Now, it was raining that morning and that night, but by the time the parade and the motorcade happened, the sky cleared. It was blue. Now, this guy came forward in the 70s, late 70s. It was a guy named Louis Stephen Witt, said he was the umbrella man, and that he was actually protesting not John Kennedy, but Joseph Kennedy's appeasement of the Nazis earlier. Now, what the fucking umbrella over his head has to do with Joe Kennedy appeasing the Nazis, I don't know, but that's what he said it was. But there's a great conspiracy theory, and let me tell you this about the umbrella man. They say that this umbrella man was holding an umbrella that was rigged with a nerve poison dart. And that when the president drove by, he hit a button on the handle, and this nerve poison dart hit the president in the throat and made him a much more docile victim. And I say, he's riding in a fucking car. How much more docile can you get?
Yeah, you're open target.
So the Umbrella Man thing is just beyond me. I mean, I think it's creepy, a photo, because you see this guy holding an umbrella and the suit and everything. But, you know, it was just, I think, some dude protesting in a way that it's like one of those protests that people have nowadays where they're protesting something, only no one knows what they're protesting. So it's like nothing's going to happen. But he was having a little completely, what'd you say, Brian?
Nothing happens anyway. It's just a bunch of loud bark until it's over.
Maybe not with you, but I've toppled governments.
Was he hanging out on the grassy knoll?
Oh, the grassy knoll. We haven't even mentioned the grassy knoll yet, because there are supposedly shooters behind the grassy knoll. There's a photograph of a guy they call the Badge Man. And it's a photograph of the grassy knoll. And if you blow it up, you can see what appears to be a man with like a badge on his breast pocket. And they say he was perhaps the second or third shooter on the grassy knoll. The way it was the president was coming this way. The book depository would have been behind him. The grassy knoll would have been in front of him. So if you had a shooter, say, on the overpass, if you had a shooter on the grassy knoll, and if you had a shooter, up in the book depository, you have a triangulation. If you've ever seen the Oliver Stone film, it was a turkey shoot, as Kevin Costner says in that. They had a turkey shoot, and because it was a triangulation of different sniper angles. What do you guys think about the grassy knoll? You think it should be mowed or what?
I don't know. I think just
stupidest joke I've ever made in my life. Go ahead, Zach.
I didn't want to be too harsh.
I don't know. I think it's bull.
I think you were the man on the grassy knoll, Zach Myers. Can you prove me wrong?
Allegedly.
You know who we can blame?
George Bush.
No, Sam from Quantum Leap.
There you go. You got two Quantum Leap nerds sitting here. Everybody else is going, what? Quantum who? It wasn't that in the Avengers?
No.
Go ahead, Brian.
I just wish I could have found what I was talking about before we went on air, that because there was a I know Bush wasn't in charge of the CIA at the time, but there was it sucks not having the information. It sucks even talking about this because I can't give you the points I want to give. But I remember years ago, back before the documentaries like on YouTube weren't so watered down and mainstream, there was some guy who found that there was this CIA operation linked to the Kennedy assassination, and it was like code name whatever the fuck, I can't remember the name, but the name was the name of George Bush's boat.
So what do you think about these theories that we're talking about with John F. Kennedy? We've covered the grassy knoll. I haven't talked about the Cuban exiles. There are some people that think Cuban exiles had something to do with the assassination. They blame Kennedy for the Bay of Pigs, and they said, you were supposed to go in and get Castro out of there, and he's destroying our country, because there was this Cuban revolution in 1959, and what happened was Fidel Castro had a coup d'etat.
AIDS here?
Say what?
Sent AIDS here?
No, he didn't send AIDS. What he did was he had a Cuban revolution.
I've heard a lot of people tell me. I've never actually looked into that one. I heard a lot of people actually that I respect though tell me they think that he sent like the AIDS virus started from Castro and was like a weapon against us. I don't know that to be true, but I've heard it.
Send all hate mail to Ryan Ray. No, I'm kidding. What we're going to talk about now, though, was this. Let me just finish the Cuban Revolution thing, because what happened was Fidel Castro ran a rebel guerrilla coup d'etat against President Batista, who was running Cuba very badly, honestly. But then Castro came in, and then he took over, and it really wasn't that much better because he was communist controlled, or at least. Well, that can go either. I mean, I don't know. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole either, because that's a whole other show, the Cuban Revolution. But that's why some people think Cuban exiles had something. What?
Leninist controlled. Be specific. He's very quirky about it.
Yeah, well, that's what Oswald always used to say. He would say, "I'm not a communist. I'm a Leninist Marxist." And so he was pro-Cuba. He actually supposedly ran in New Orleans Fair Play for Cuba chapter office, the New Orleans chapter office. Come to find out, Fair Play for Cuba was a committee that was based in New York. He had written them saying, could I open a chapter in New Orleans? And they said no. Well, he opened a chapter anyway. And he went on the street and was handing out pamphlets and stuff. And he was like, we got hundreds of members. No, I think he said we have 35. But it's like, we have members and I'm the secretary and there's a president. And come to find out, like Lee Harvey Oswald was the only guy talking about Fair Play for Cuba in New Orleans at that time. But he was creating this idea that he was a part of this organization and had set it up. And he was recruiting all these people. So that was maybe another time that Oswald, tried to inflate himself a little more than he would. Now, he actually got into a fist fight on the street with some Cuban exiles. That is a fact. But
is there footage?
There is footage I think there's more footage of the aftermath. Because I've seen footage of him pointing like to guys, like some of these Cuban exile guys, pointing to them and saying, and there were cops there. So I'm assuming that he's pointing out the guy that did it. Because Oswald, wasn't a big guy, but he liked to fight. He was like 5'8" and 135 pounds, soaking wet.
I was supposed to say wet.
Yeah. So, but that didn't keep him from fighting with Cuban exiles and his superiors in the Marines and guys on the street and his coworkers and everybody else, or the cops in Texas. So, Zach, what are you thinking over there? You haven't gotten much of a chance to talk about the conspiracy theories of JFK. Even though we know you were the man on the grassy knoll, you little badge on.
Quit telling people. No, it was between Oswald or the mob.
You think Jack Ruby had more to do with it than just killing Oswald? Because what the Warren Commission eventually said was that Oswald worked alone in killing Kennedy, and Jack Ruby worked alone in killing Oswald. So therefore, no conspiracy.
Maybe Ruby thought that Oswald was gonna flap his gums or something. I don't know.
Well, if you believe the mafia conspiracy, that's a big part of it. That the mafia had.
It's really convenient that the patsy gets shot like instantly.
And that was
if he was a patsy.
And that's the word that he used, because they asked him in the hallways. The reporters got into the halls of police headquarters and they said, "Did you kill the president?" And he said, "No, I'm a patsy." And they said, "What happened to your eye, sir?" He said, "A policeman hit me." I kind of like listening to Oswald when he talks because he has this really weird cadence to his voice. But Jack Ruby was okay. Oswald was killed by Jack Ruby 2 days after Kennedy's assassination. Ruby, the day of Oswald's arrest, which was the day of the assassination, is actually on film in the corridors posing as a news reporter when Ruby is being taken from one interrogation room to another. And there is a press conference where a pretty famous one that was really short, where they hauled Oswald out to talk to the press, and Ruby is standing there. And there are photographs of him standing at this press conference. And he said that he had the handgun in his coat. And he had it the whole time he was in the police department. Now, Ruby, allegedly at the Carousel Club, often entertained police officers. And sometimes maybe even set up an evening for them that involved more than dancing. Say that again?
Exactly.
And so
I guess I forgot. Well, yeah, I heard. Yeah, I heard like part of it for a second, and then went out. And then when I came back, I heard what you said, and I was like, yeah, that it was funny to me for a second. I put it like that.
Well, when the cops were very familiar with Jack Ruby, in fact, when he shot Oswald, one of the cops turned to him and said, "Jack, you son of a bitch," and that's on the tape of him getting. They knew who Oswald was. He frequented the police department a lot. He had also been arrested a few times, but he was friendly with a lot of these cops, probably because of, as I said, he entertained them at his club. What's that?
Oh, Ruby?
Jack Ruby. No. Jack Ruby is what I meant. Yes, thank you. Jack Ruby. Yeah. So Ryan thinks it's Lyndon Johnson and George Bush.
Yeah.
Zach thinks it's the mafia.
at the same time, though, I think it's one of the best conspiracies because there's so many like I'll sit here and say what I think, but like I don't know. Other things I have like a pretty strong like, no, this is what happened. Or with this, there's so many things that make sense, and there's so many reasons that he would have had a problem with a lot of different people, and a lot of different people that had a lot of power when it came to murdering you. It's not like he had a problem with your Aunt Betty down the street. Like not good. Sam Giancana, not a good guy to have a problem with. Uh, any problem he had was bad. So that's the thing. I don't know if this will ever really be. Didn't they say though that they're going to release the rest of the documents because they got Trump to back down on releasing everything, and now there's supposed to be a date to release everything, but I don't think they ever will.
Yeah, I don't know. That's one of those things where it's like, what is everything? We don't even know how many there are. So, I mean, you could say you released everything and not. I mean, I wouldn't know. I don't know. There's not a number. We have this many we're going to release. So, yeah, we probably will never see everything. But my personal opinion, when I was like in my 20s, I was really big into the JFK conspiracies and stuff. And then I kind of changed, and I think Oswald acted alone, honestly. That
story you told in the intro actually got me leaning a little bit towards, wow, this guy may have actually been the guy that did it.
Yeah, that Oswald may have just been the guy that did it. Rebecca, what's your opinion on this, or are you?
I'd probably say just Oswald. I mean, I used to be the same way as him. I used to think, oh, it could have been this, it could have been that. I mean, it's interesting to read all these things and watch all the documentaries on it, but some of them are a little bit.
Didn't Jesse even, when he had his conspiracy show, try to like, when you were talking earlier, Rebecca, about like the time in between shots, didn't he try to like do something where he showed it on camera and like he would go across? He's like, see, like it's impossible.
Yeah, but Jesse Ventura always kind of bends things to what he wants it to be. It's like, because he's really pushing that conspiracy thing. So if it doesn't fit the conspiracy theory, he kind of disregards it.
Yeah.
He's got that really convincing voice.
And my thing was always, my favorite one was him, was when he did the guy about time travel, and he showed a guy a picture and was like, that's you in Gettysburg. And the guy's looking at him like, I'm not in Gettysburg. I'm like 50 years old. Go ahead. What were you saying?
Oh, I was going to say, I do, though, find it interesting that Bobby felt it was a conspiracy. And also, we were talking before the show about Jackie, her, didn't believe it was the Russians that did it. And
yeah, she left the country for a while and lived outside the country for a long time because she said that it just wasn't safe. Now, she never went into detail about why it wasn't safe or why it wasn't safe in America or whatever, but for many years, she said she just didn't feel like America was safe for her. So she left and married.
That's got to be tough to get over, like, going through that whole ordeal. That can't be good for anybody.
Man, I don't know. Seeing that right in front of you is.
And then you have your 2 children.
Yeah. So, I mean, my personal opinion is that Oswald acted alone. Beyond that, I think that Zach was the Secret Service man in the car with the AR-15 that hit the bump. Come on, Zach, you can admit it. It's been years. Get over it.
He's the one I actually found out about this conspiracy.
Because my father was the Zodiac, it was just my life has gone downhill.
I tell you, it's just, you've just left a trail of destruction behind you, all he is.
I thought your dad was the Night Stalker, Richard Ramirez.
He got around. All right. Well, we had a lot of fun, guys, and thank you all for watching and joining us. And let me know what you think of the JFK assassination. Till next time, take care of yourselves.